Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Reinventing Real Estate podcast with Nadine Buckland, co-founder of Zenzic Capital.
It was honestly such a joy to interview her. I feel like she gave us such good lessons, whether it's hiring people, whether it's kind of how to learn from the imposter syndrome, confidence, business. There was just so much there.
So much. And I think one key takeaway I really loved was being confident enough to show up as yourself and truly like being yourself. And I think she exhibited that so much through this podcast.
I think it was also about hiring and that career versus job element I found really fascinating, and how to find the right partner as well, and that gut feel behind it. So there was just so much there in the podcast. I'm excited to listen back to it, and I'm excited for all of you to listen to it as well.
Absolutely. So make sure you tune into this episode if you're looking to learn about becoming a founder of a business. Is it a myth to have a work-life balance when you're a founder? And just really diving in head first. There's so many tips that you can take away. So Nadine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So we're going to start with, what is your why now and when you started, and has that evolved through your journey?
So I think the initial why was very much driven, as a lot of individuals are driven by their parents and what their parents think. My father, who unfortunately passed away when I was 26, he saw very early on into my journey and my career that perhaps I was going to be better suited to being in charge of my own destiny rather than being part of a larger corporate and taking a corporate journey. And that made me really think quite early on to, is he right, isn't he right? And I tested it like everyone does. You kind of take a job and then take another job, and as each one doesn't quite work out, you think, maybe he's right and I should listen to my father. And after he passed away, I think obviously like everybody, you take time, you reflect, you go through a grieving process, and which obviously continues even to this day. But at the same time, it gave me the opportunity to really think about what was it that I really wanted to create for myself in life. And I was always very driven, always very motivated, always worked very hard, had a strong work ethic. But I think that really came into its fore when I formed Zenzic. And I'd seen a lot of change in the market during the career that I was having at the time. Prior to creating Zenzic, the emergence of the non-bank lending market started in the UK post-GFC, and I could see a real gap in that space. And that was really what I was looking for. Where could I really add value? How could I actually make enough capital to kind of drive what I really wanted to achieve in life? And at the time, I was doing a lot of work with EY, and I met Tom Lloyd-Jones through that process, who I then founded Zenzic with. And I think that was really the start of it. You don't have to start a business with someone. You can definitely start a business on your own. There's plenty of people that have done that. But I felt for being able to drive the business that I wanted to, I needed to find someone to complement my skill set with. I was someone who was very good at relationship building. I was great at the deal origination aspects of the business that I was in, but I needed someone to work with that could bring to it a different skill set, more on structuring and modelling and strategy. I had a vision, but I really needed someone to work with that on. And I think we found in each other that actually we could complement each other's skill sets. We worked well together, and we both saw the same gap. So that non-bank lending market was the genesis of Zenzic. It was that actually there were all these companies setting up in the UK that were offering capital to borrowers, and those borrowers couldn't really access it very easily. And what we felt at the time was that because it being so opaque, it would be great to have an advisory business that really could access that capital, understood it, could advise well in that market. And I think both of us felt that we had the right skill sets to do that. together. And so that was really what we started, back 13 years ago, was an advisory business to access that capital for borrowers. But always with the view that we wanted to become an investment management firm. I remember sitting in an Italian restaurant in Exchange Square, just behind Liverpool Street Station, and we had, a piece of paper, pencil, and we were writing down kind of what would the business plan look like. And right at the start, we said we wanted to become an investment management firm. It's just we didn't have any track record to do it. So how were we going to achieve that? The advisory business allowed us to achieve it. It meant that we could build balance sheet and then build the business from there. So the why at the start was very much about not feeling like I was ever going to really succeed in a truly corporate environment. And has the why evolved? I think the why now has changed a little bit to, the day-to-day of building something that's now, bigger than it was to begin with, is driven a lot by now having had a family. You have children, and maybe that changes how you think about life. I think for everybody that's had children, they would probably say that. And so now what I'm trying to build is a much bigger business than maybe what I set out to achieve at the outset. You have ambition, but I suppose I'm a bit of a realist, and I didn't necessarily think I was going to completely achieve what we've achieved already by this point. So great that we have. Great that we're now on another journey, kind of what I call Zenzic 3.0. It's definitely gone through a few stages in that 13 years. The children, for me, has meant that I'm looking at them thinking, what do I want to achieve for them in life? And I want to give them optionality. Yes, of course, my parents did a great job of allowing me to kind of have these options in life to be able to create my own business. But I want them to be able to really take opportunities that maybe I wasn't able to. I didn't travel with work, for example. I didn't go abroad for a period of my career. I've always been in London. I'd love them to have those opportunities in life. And, the business allows me, hopefully, to be able to give them, that next level of what, I'd love for them to experience. So I think that now every day is one of the things that drives me and is the why.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. And I think there's so much there. But what interests me about what you said is you're obviously remarkably young, 32, when you founded Zenzic. Mm-hmm. And winding forward to today, you've clearly built something that's, really exciting and growing really fast, but has made a massive impact on the marketplace. But how did you feel the creation of the business and going through the business actually materialized? And was it as you expected? Because I think a lot of people glamorize business and get sort of excited about this journey and growth and think it's just an upwards trajectory, but it'd be great to hear more from you.
Yeah, so the business itself has changed materially from the day that we founded the firm, but with purpose. We wanted to achieve what we've achieved at this point, which has been the journey from an advisory business into an investment management business, and we've now left that advisory business behind. That sort of stopped now 5 years ago, and the journey is tough. Anyone that tries to glamorize owning a business, I think, is not necessarily really sharing the true picture of what it takes to sustain a business on a long-term basis and keep thinking about its growth and its journey and having to move with markets. In the period of time that we founded Zenzic, we've gone through Brexit, we've gone through COVID, we've gone through multiple prime ministers, we've gone through interest rate rises. It's definitely been, a journey of a lot of ups and downs, and having to think on your feet constantly about how to maneuver around those markets and continue its growth story. And that means making some very tough decisions at points. And I think the other piece to it is the evolution of a business doesn't necessarily just happen purely because of market changes or, through kind of organic shifts. You have to really be very thoughtful on a regular basis about, are we making the right decisions to take us on the journey that we're trying to take, but not necessarily be too fixed in your view about where the business's journey is headed. What you start with isn't necessarily what you necessarily end with, but the end can be just as great, even though it wasn't what you envisaged. Where we're lucky, I guess, is that we wanted to create the investment management business, but did we want it to take 13 years to get to that point? Probably not. We would have, I think we're very pleased with where we've got to, and we're very glad of, the support that we've had from the market to achieve that journey. But, it's been tough to achieve over that period, because in that time you've got to bring people on the journey with you. Employees have got to really believe in you, and you have a lot of that weight on your shoulders on a daily basis, where people are looking to you for the answers all the time, and sometimes you don't have all the answers. Try your best, but you don't always. And so do I think that we've achieved what I would have liked to have achieved in the time frame? Probably yes, on balance. Do I think we could have maybe achieved some of the stuff that we've done earlier? Yes, if we'd made different decisions at earlier points in the journey that we took. Do I always think that I've made the right decisions on hiring, on where we're investing capital, at the points that we were investing capital? Not always. I think we've done a great job. We've not had any capital losses as a business in the time that we've invested capital, which is great. But do I think we could have made some, better decisions earlier on? Absolutely. And I think anyone that owns a business will say you have to learn constantly from your mistakes. And I think from our perspective, though, on balance, I feel like we've done as good as we could have done with the people and the knowledge that we had as we've grown.
What really interests me about what you just said as well is that hiring piece, because I think people struggle so much sometimes in hiring the right groups of people and making sure that the culture is aligned.
Absolutely.
How do you do that, and what have you learned over the years as someone who is leading a business, may have had some challenges or wrong hires, and essentially sort of what's the lessons, Nadine?
Yeah, I mean, the hiring piece is always a challenge, I think, for any business owner, because the first point that I've sort of had to learn is the difference between people that want careers and people that want jobs. And as we've grown and changed as a business, we've needed different people. And sometimes that means you make tough decisions about individuals that perhaps have shown a great deal of loyalty to the firm, but that aren't necessarily the right people for the next phase of the journey. And that's always difficult. And trying to get the right work ethic and the right drive and ambition, and not necessarily always thinking that everyone needs to be like you. For a while I struggled with, why aren't you necessarily answering emails at midnight? I'm awake. It's 2 a.m. and I'm responding to things. But that's the life of an owner. You live, sleep, breathe, eat it. I mean, it's endless. It doesn't stop. It's weekends. But when people talk about work-life balance, my work-life balance is my work, because I'm so passionate about it. And of course I'm going to be, because I own the business. And but not everybody has to be like that to add value to the firm. We're very much about having a meritocracy. We want people that are exceptional people in the business, smaller teams, but full of exceptional people. And I think that has been something that we have learned along the way works for us as a culture. And, there's been times where we've had larger teams, more layers, and actually for us as a firm, culture-wise, that doesn't really work. But you have to kind of go through these phases as you grow a firm to work out what type of individuals work and what type of individuals don't work, and they can be quite tough conversations sometimes, because there's people that often have been brilliant through a phase, have offered a lot of loyalty, a lot of drive, but then this next phase, for example, maybe they aren't necessarily the right people for. And I think that as an owner is really hard to make, to work within those within the decision making, boundaries that you've got to make sometimes, and you've got to have your own boundaries to be able to make those decisions. And I've been sometimes a bit bad for that, if I'm honest. Like certain people in the firm want to keep them forever because they're great people and they're nice people and they're great humans, and sometimes that's not what you need. It's you've got to try and find a balance in a team, but the key thing for me is allowing people to have a voice and making them feel safe. That's the other piece to running a business and being a good leader is making everybody in the firm feel like they are equally wanted, equally appreciated. And sometimes you have people that shout louder than others. And, naturally a human instinct is probably to turn the attention to someone that shouts the loudest, tells you everything of what they're doing. And, I've definitely had that in the firm over time where, they take a call and they tell you about it instantly afterwards. And you naturally gravitate sometimes to those people because it's easy to communicate with them. But actually sometimes the people that are not necessarily the ones that sell themselves the best are actually brilliant value to the business, bringing a lot of value to the business. So I've really struggled sometimes with hiring, and we've really learnt now the types of questions that we need to ask in interviews to really drive into what is getting them out of bed every day, the why, because that drives often what their ambition is. Are they looking for a job or are they looking for a career? And I'm trying to ask questions that really give me a sense of, how much they really want to be thinking about the business on a daily basis, their business. Because whilst it's my company, if someone's got the ethos of being a bit more entrepreneurial, then that will help with what we're trying to achieve right now.
Agreed.
When you're someone who, for example, just wants to do a 9 to 5, that works certainly in maybe bigger companies, but in smaller companies that are growing, in my view, some of those people are valuable as well, but not necessarily needed in volume. And that's really what we've worked out, is that actually for us, having a smaller team, as I say, of exceptional people that are very driven, are very career hungry, maybe you don't keep them for that long. Maybe those are the sorts of people that come in, do 2-3 years and move to another firm because they're very driven to want more, and maybe we can't quite offer them that next step in their journey. But actually having those people in for 3 years is sometimes better than the person who might offer 6-10-year tenures but don't have that career drive at the heart of them. They would rather go home and do something else in the evenings that they are more interested in life, and that's absolutely fine. People need to do things that they're passionate about. I just need everyone in my business at the moment to be passionate about the growth that we're trying to achieve within Zenzic.
Totally. And also, you said about some questions that you guys have formulated to ask particular new joiners and interviewees. Mm-hmm. Are there any particular questions that you can pinpoint that people could then replicate in their own businesses when they're hiring?
Yeah. Actually, one of the first questions that I ask candidates when they arrive in to see me, because I'm often the last person that they're meeting, and I ask them first whether or not they've got any questions for me before I ask them any questions about them. And the reason I do that as an owner is because I want to see what really is making them think about Zenzic as a firm. And if the first question they ask is about, work-life balance, how we structure the organisation on a day-to-day basis to allow people to have more flexibility in their working days, then honestly, those people probably aren't going to be the people that I then take forward and offer a job to. And it's not because I don't want people to value work-life balance, because everyone, I think about people's wellness regularly. I give people wellness days. I want people to feel like they can have things outside of work that they're passionate about. But I want them much more interested in, why did I create Zenzic? Why, what is getting me out of bed every day? What am I passionate about? Because that will allow them to figure out whether this is a business that they should be a part of. So That's actually the first thing I do in an interview. And now I've given away the trade secrets, because obviously now
Well, that's what we
comes,
like on this
everyone that
podcast.
comes into
Everyone
our
now,
interview
yeah,
with
they're gonna
Zenzic
say
is going
that
to be
as the first
ready.
thing. So what gets you up in the morning?
ready with questions that are not related
When's
to
my interview next week,
my
Nadine?
work-life balance. But I always ask what questions they have for us. And then when I'm trying to unpick somebody to really get to know them as individuals, then I am asking them about, what made them take their first job. Because is it because they just really wanted to make money and they needed a job and it didn't really matter what it was, but actually it was just getting them into the workplace? Or was it, for example, that there was something they were particularly passionate about? And there's no real right answers to that, but it's just trying to get under the hood of who are they as a person and how are they guided? A bit like when I started with, my father suggested that I create my own business. And so that got me thinking maybe I should create my own business because he probably knows me better than anybody else. That actually is really helpful to understand if someone's had support in their families. And I ask people, what did their parents do for a living? I want to understand a bit about them as, and their backgrounds, their upbringing, and again, no right or wrong answers. We've worked with individuals in Zenzic who have had parents who have worked in very, very different industries to the one that we're in. And actually, the reason why they're in our industry is because there was a friend of a friend that gave them, an idea at some point in their, journey of education that this would be a good career for them. So what I always want to try and do is get to the root of who they are as people. And also I ask them about friendships. I ask people about, how many people do they kind of socialize with in their outside of work, and where did they last go on holiday? And I know these aren't necessarily really intricate, detailed questions about what they're doing in their jobs every day, but what I want to get to the point of is understanding who they are as people, because I feel that this business is a very human capital business. It's a relationship driven business, and if they're individuals that I can sort of understand as people, then I can help shape their careers and help them achieve what they want to. And that's what I'm trying to get to. Obviously, I have people in the team that will have gone through modelling exercises if it's an analyst role, and they would have talked to them about how they originate transactions, and the more, I suppose, quantitative aspects of their career. I'm interested in the qualitative aspects, and then I think, are these people that are going to fit in the culture of Zenzic?
So Nadine, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever received?
Now, this is an interesting one, and it goes back to a very long time ago. I would have been probably 23 or 24, so quite early on in my career. So the person that provided me this advice, I think looking back, they were quite an insecure individual. But it was effectively that you aren't going to achieve what you want to achieve in life unless you follow all the rules set by the firm. And that means being in 20 minutes earlier every day than your boss is, and never leaving before your boss leaves, and what they called rules that were not written but should just be followed. And I look back at that as a piece of advice and I think I did it for a while. And it got me nowhere, because yes, of course, you're sort of playing some form of political game in doing that. But actually, is that really truly what senior management want from their employees at the end of it, when it comes to thinking about, promotions and how they think about the future generations of employees that might take on more leadership roles? I think I focused on those for a while and realised, luckily for me, quite quickly, that was not what was going to allow me to achieve what I wanted to in my career. And I'm not saying rules are always there to be broken. I definitely am more of a rule breaker than I am a rule maker in life. And I want people now within Zenzic to be that. This is not about, as I said earlier, it's a meritocracy at Zenzic. This is not about who gets in earliest and who leaves latest is the ones that are going to achieve the most in Zenzic. But I really firmly believe that's bad advice to people. And I think even if you're working in a really large corporate, I think what ultimately people want are individuals that communicate well, that they're driven, they're motivated, they think outside the box, they go the extra mile because they really want to, because at their heart, they're trying to achieve something in their careers. And I think senior management in small companies and big companies see that in individuals, and they're the people that they can see as being future leaders. And so what I would always encourage people now to do is look at thinking about what they want to achieve in their careers. And I tell this to people that I mentor, and I try and mentor at least one individual at any one time during a 6-month period. I say, look, don't have a huge plan, but do have some view on what you want to try and achieve in life, and think about the key things that allow you to achieve that, i.e., is it learning about your industry sector in particular segments of the market? Is it about getting out there and networking and saying hello to anyone that will say hello to you? If you're not naturally a social person and networking is difficult, then thinking about how you can create those relationships in different ways. Don't have to be a social animal to create networks. You can use LinkedIn. It's a great tool to create a network of people that you can call upon, that you can mediate with on, things that you're perhaps doing in your career as next steps.
True.
And so that's kind of been my my learnings from what I think was not necessarily the best advice at an early stage in my career.
I love that point around that you don't necessarily need to be a social person in this day and age to make those connections, and using the toolkits that are available to us, like LinkedIn, where you can just look up essentially anyone within the working world.
Absolutely.
Is incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
And it gives people the opportunity to reach out to people that might be incredibly senior.
Yeah.
But, a click of a button, you've got access to them in a way that you wouldn't have 20 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, I met a lady the other day whose son is now in his sort of late 20s. But when he was 15, he sent emails out to as many people within Goldman Sachs as he could that had an MD title. And he was just asking, can I have a call with you just to better understand Goldman's? Well, of the however many he reached out to, he got around 10 replies that led to calls. That led to an internship early on, that kind of 16-year-old age where you're doing your GCSEs. That then led to further opportunities within Goldman's when he had breaks, because he built a relationship and network with people that he then met through that first internship. And he's now a really senior, at quite a young age, guy within a different investment bank, no longer with Goldman's, but did start his career there. And, he didn't have any background in that space at all. She was saying she was a chiropodist. Her husband was something completely unrelated to anything to do with financial services. It was just something that their son was driven to want to do. And that shows you the power of LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And the confidence to stand out as well.
And absolutely, you couldn't have done that 20 years ago. You had to be bold. You had to be willing to pick up the phone and speak to people. And I am a big advocate for that. I don't love it when people hide completely behind emails. I do encourage my team to pick up the phone and speak to people and have human relationships that interact, both in person and over the phone. But the reality is that not everybody finds that naturally that comfortable, and you can have a very successful career building great relationships with people without necessarily needing to be the person that can walk into a room of 100 people and say hello to the first person that comes up to you.
I just want to come back to what you said before about founders not having all the answers, because I think there's something really interesting to unpack there about creating a team that also realizes that, you're not bionic, you're also human.
Yeah.
And, you might want to kind of walk away and think about something, or kind of talk to the team about something, and not always having to be that figure that kind of swoops in with all the answers, but still having and building that faith within a team.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the meritocracy and the want for people to feel safe so they can share their views and opinions on things. And I need that because I don't always have the answers. Ultimately, we are only as good as the experiences that we've had in life to some extent. And you can obviously then find learnings from other people through reading, and I read a lot, and so does my co-founder Tom, and we often find, you know, really interesting books that help us with some guidance, certainly on leadership. I think that there are many good books in that space.
Which ones in particular?
Daniel, I've spoken about this book before, but I absolutely love it. Daniel Coyle, The Culture Code. And it talks very much about the fact that teams aren't just a product of the hiring that you do, in terms of how they think and feel and the culture that you've created. That actually it's in part through leadership and in part through shared experience and learned experience from other organisations that creates a good team. And you have to really think about that when you're formulating your team. You do want diverse thought. Something that we really focus on at Zenzic is not always having people from the same backgrounds. We've drawn on people from backgrounds in asset management, in an investment management setting. We bring those individuals into our investment committees because we want to be able to have someone at the table always that has operated real estate as much as invested into real estate and seen the learnings of, you know, where credit, for example, has potentially gone wrong in other shops that they've worked in. We want those people to come to the table, but we also want the people that really understand how truly real estate day to day works, because it's not always, for us, we're lending money. And sometimes when you lend, you can look at a transaction and it looks great on paper, but potentially the counterparties that you're lending to aren't necessarily the right people that should be a chaperone of your capital, or the business plan isn't necessarily the right business plan for what they're trying to achieve. And all of those learnings from people that, you know, come to the table are very important. And I want to hear all of that. I don't want people to feel like they can't say what they really truly think about a transaction. So from my perspective, it's actually really important for everybody to feel like they can contribute, and we can debate hard in those environments, you know, and there
I've
can
witnessed
be
it.
Yeah, you have. Yeah, and we can definitely, and we should disagree, because
Yeah.
everyone's a human.
Yeah,
they have
that's
opinions.
important.
Really important. And people should feel that they can disagree, and disagree with senior management as well on a point. I like it when people fight for
Like
things.
challenge.
Absolutely, challenge all the time. But what's really important is once we've made the decision that we're all going forward as a team together. And that's the piece that I think you have to try and get right. That once you've made that core decision to take something forward, that everybody is behind it and everyone then is rowing in the right direction. So, you know, when you're building a team, you're trying to complement the experience that you've got within a senior leadership function with people that want to become senior leaders in the business, that can bring and add value through all of that experience. And that's not just in work. It's back to why I ask people in interviews questions about far more about them as people and trying to unpack who they are, because life experience adds so much value. You know, when I think about how I assess borrowers, people that we're going to partner with in transactions, a lot of my views on individuals is driven by my experience of growing up as a child and sitting around a table with my father and business people at a young age, and being given that exposure and listening to their conversations and hearing the types of questions my father asked people in meetings. And, you know, it wasn't always a formal meeting. It was often in a very social setting. So that's another thing I like to do, is I always like to meet people not just in a corporate setting. I'll take people out of the corporate setting, take them for drinks, take them for dinner. And I do that with interviews as well, because you see a different side to people in a non-corporate setting.
Do.
And it makes a big difference sometimes to your decision making about either hiring or in our case, lending capital to people. So you can't as an owner always have the answers, but you can build teams to support you with that decision making who have a lot of value to bring.
How did you find Tom as a partner? How should people, when they're starting a business, find potential partners, and what should they look for?
So there's a piece around the human element and just generally gelling well with someone. And then there's the piece around your vision and goals and what you all want out of life. And that, I think, is a really tough thing to find in trying to find a business partner. And in many ways, it's much of what you look for potentially in a life partner outside of work. You have to think differently about the journey when you're building a business, because there's often scenarios where people want for something at the beginning and then maybe they're different age groups, and so they get 5 years into it and actually one person who's maybe older than the other may want at that point something different in the journey, and are they then going to go in the same direction still, or are they going to go apart? All of these things are quite difficult to figure out early on. I think there's part of you that's always going to have a natural gut feel for another human being who you can build a business with. And that will be because maybe you've worked with one another. Maybe you haven't worked in the same business with one another, but you've interacted very well with one another. And that was certainly the case with Tom and I. We didn't work in the same business together, but we worked alongside each other in multiple scenarios and realised actually we have very shared thinking about just generally the market. And at the time, people that we were interacting with, we would often have similar views of those individuals. And so we were able to see quite early on that actually we thought quite similarly in a number of different settings. And that gave us maybe the confidence that actually when you combined our skill sets that were different to one another but complementary, and then you combined how we thought about what we wanted to achieve in life, and we were very similar ages, we felt that this was potentially going to be a good combination. But we also set very short-term goals. I mean, we both said going into it, if we didn't make money in the first year, we would go back to our previous careers. And we were fortunate enough within the first year, but towards the back end of the first year, so it was touch and go, as to making that first advisory fee. And that then allowed us to say, okay, so we've made some money, we can go again into the next year. And we said it exactly the same again. So we always felt that if we hadn't really achieved what we wanted to achieve within sort of year 2, which was to have really made enough to feel that we had a genuine business, not just doing a couple of deals and making some money. We had to really try within that sort of next year, the year after the first year, to have created some form of business structure that we could really scale. And within year 2, we'd done multiple transactions. We'd started to think about having an office and our first hire. I mean, the first few years, we literally drove around in a car around London, holding meetings in the car on conference calls because that was a quiet place, and then working in hotel lobbies. I mean, we wanted to keep the costs really low. We wanted to be flexible, and we didn't want to overcommit capital to something that we didn't know definitely had legs. So, we were very careful about that. And again, that was really very aligned. There's a lot of people that have differences of opinion even in those early stages where they say, look, let's get an office, let's get a backer. We were very aligned. We said, look, let's organically grow, let's not have any additional third party pressure where we get someone to finance the business's growth but who maybe then we don't necessarily see eye to eye with or has different vision for the business than we do. We wanted to be in charge of our own destiny. So I think when you're thinking about who to partner with, it doesn't necessarily need to be a very long-standing relationship. You don't need to have worked together for a decade. But I do think that you can figure out quite early on whether or not some of the same objectives are there between you, that you want to achieve things over a similar time frame. We said look, if we can achieve becoming an investment management business within a decade, then we would be, very happy with that. It took us 13 years, not a decade. But at a decade, we could see the direction of travel. We'd already started investing capital. We'd created our real estate lending business, Zenzic Development Finance, which, remains a growing business in its own right outside of our now opportunistic credit business. So we could see where we were headed, and we felt that we were going to achieve what we wanted to achieve. So we gave it longer to achieve that next phase of growth. So I think in finding people, it's a difficult one, Jamie. It's hard, isn't it?
It is hard.
To find good people that you really feel day-to-day aligned with. And I think that goes for personal lives as much as it does business life. It's hard enough in personal lives, and this is like a marriage, right? Because you've got to want to grow together and want the same things along that journey. And, you see divorces happening all the time, and that's the same in business. You see divorces happening all the time. And having a happy divorce is hard. So, you want to try and find people that, ideally do want to achieve the same things over the same period of time as you, as I think a bare minimum.
I think it's interesting because it's being honest with each other, but it's also being very honest with yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people think that they want to be founders, or think that they want this sort of large scale business and to be a CEO. But what they don't really want is the responsibility or the travel requirements or the pressure or the lack of work-life balance that actually materialises on the back of that.
Yeah.
I think also knowing yourself goes like a step further in terms of knowing where your strengths are, and then knowing where your kind of partner's strengths are, and then being able to say, look, listen, you're better suited, or you're more informed on that. What do you think? Like, what's your call? This is not my strength, or let me deal with this because, I feel like I'm better suited to take on this challenge. So actually it's also like looking in and knowing, being really comfortable with each other about saying, I'm better at that, you take that because you're better at that, and then you're able to delegate and do so much more.
I think what's really important when you're working with someone very closely is the ability to work out, as you say, who's got a strength in a certain area, who's got a weakness in a certain area, not push each other to try and fill each other's gaps. Actually, sometimes, what Tom and I do is very much play to each other's strengths. We're very good at saying, I'm no good at doing that. You are much better positioned to do it, and vice versa. And, for example, Tom is definitely less of a social animal than I am. So I'm very comfortable in social settings. He is far more comfortable in more corporate settings. So great in meetings, great one-to-one, probably doesn't want to always do the social networking with 100 people in a room. I'll happily do that piece. So, it's really important, I think, to not push each other to do things that actually neither of you feel very comfortable in doing, because that ultimately just leads to an argument. And, but you learn that about each other as you grow and as you build a business, and you learn actually suddenly that there's an area that I thought I wasn't great at, but actually I turn out to be fine at it. And and vice versa. In both scenarios, we've certainly both had that. I've grown far more in confidence in certain situations that he always said I was really great at, and I didn't believe him, and vice versa. And so I think also being able to point out when someone's done something well, when someone's done something not so well, being able to take on each other's feedback. That's something that we've had to both learn to do better than we did when we first started the business. I wasn't always great at taking feedback that was negative. I was always a bit defensive, and I don't think he was the same, actually. He's always been someone who's always very welcoming of feedback, both negative and positive. I've had to grow up a bit with that. I think it's an only child thing. I grew up on my own, and You
You're
know,
like, what do you mean?
was
I'm
always
perfect.
and all was always great, obviously, because that's what my parents told me. You know, being pointed out sometimes that you're not so good at something that you thought you were good at. You know, and that I think is again being part of a truly good business partnership. Being able to listen to one another, being able to sit down and not interrupt each other all the time. That's something that I've personally again had to kind of grow to be better at. And I think, you know, Tom is someone who wants always to be evolving, always to be growing, always to be getting better. And, you know, he thrives on learning from others, from reading and from developing. And I'm probably a slower person to graduate in development than he is. And I think he's had to learn that about me over time. Mine is a confidence issue. I always have a crisis of confidence. I'm the person that definitely suffers from imposter syndrome. I'm terrible with that. Sit in a room.
That's not something I would ever thought
Yeah.
of,
Oh, yeah.
Nadine.
Terrible. I sit in rooms and I think, God, should I be here? Like, why am I at the table? I think that's something that a lot of founders experience and don't necessarily always want to own up to. But I've worked with people on imposter syndrome to try and give myself the confidence that actually I am in the room for a reason, and I have credibility in certain spaces, and I have knowledge of things that perhaps actually go deeper than I even realise I have knowledge of. And Tom actually is really very good at figuring that out about people generally, not just me, and giving people confidence and the space to be able to really thrive. And, you know, that's part of being a great, you know, business partner. And I think what I do, you know, to complement Tom is to try and push him into areas where I think he should have a voice. You know, he's a great writer. He's a great strategist. He's someone who I think will, as we grow in Zenzic, he will have more of a voice in the market than perhaps he's had previously, because I've always taken that front seat. And actually, he's brilliant at having these type of conversations, but he comes at it from a very different space sometimes. And so, yeah, I think that dividing and conquering across all aspects of the business is really, you know, a big part of how you grow, how you scale. When I look back, we probably spent too long doing the same things together all the time. You know, I remember kind of always being in the same meetings. It's always Nadine and Tom, and everyone would say it's like the Tom and Nadine show. And learning actually that, you know, you can not necessarily always need to be together in these things. That I can take on meetings that actually I've always wanted him at, but actually I can do them just as well on my own without him, and vice versa, and or utilising the team more. You know, we have a great team, and I've talked about the meritocracy, but it's very easy as a founder to take the meeting, to say yes, to be the people pleaser, and, you know, everyone always wants a founder in the room, and sometimes you can't always be in the room. You can't be at every single meeting. It's just not possible. And so building the infrastructure to support the business's growth has been certainly something that we've focused on. In the last year, we've built far more in back office than we have in front, and that's empowered me to be able to do more in terms of the capital raising and the driving of the strategy, and really living and breathing the bits that I love doing on a daily basis, which is meeting great people and speaking with people like yourselves, and, you know, thinking about what's the next phase of the journey. So yeah.
So let's talk about conflict. In every business, obviously, it's an inevitable that you're going to come across some form of disagreement, argument, whether that's internally or with a partner, a JV partner, a debt partner, whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? And how would you advise other people to deal with that? Whether that's as an employee or as an employer or a member of a partnership.
The starting point is always really understanding as much as you can about the person in whom you're either hiring or going into partnership with from a business perspective, or in our case, providing capital to as a borrower. I always talk about this, certainly in business, I talk about the fact that you can't make a good loan to a bad borrower. Who they are as people, go such a long way to how they cope in conflict and how they cope with situations that they weren't necessarily anticipating to have to deal with. Communication, being open and honest about what's going on at any one time is, whether that be as an employee, in how they think and feel about the business, having open forums for discussion, that all of those sorts of techniques and tools allow you to cope with conflict, I think, in a more effective way, where people feel that they can share and they're not holding things in, is really important. So relationship building is at its heart, and that's with everything that you do in life, in my view. If you've got strong relationships with people, if you're communicating regularly, if you talk to them very early on about there being an open door, always open to hearing, your views, your suggestions, and or where you think things are going wrong, that ultimately leads, I think, to a much better outcome when it comes to dealing with conflict. And there are times, certainly when you think about sort of the work that we do as a lender, absolutely, inevitably things will go wrong during potentially the life of a loan that weren't envisaged. And the outcomes that we've certainly experienced so far, which has been very positive, where we have suffered some level of conflict or something that's not necessarily gone to plan in our original underwrite, those outcomes have been positive because we've had great relationships with the underlying counterparties whom we provided capital to. And so I think it's the effort that you put into a relationship is what you're going to get out of it. If you're someone who doesn't want to invest time in people, then conflicts are always potentially going to inevitably lead to a negative outcome. If you've given time to someone, if you've spent time getting to know them, understanding what matters to them, understanding how they think in scenarios where there is a negative. So one of the things we always ask borrowers is, can we take references from somebody that you've dealt with where things haven't gone well? We want to know, going into those deals, whether or not somebody has coped in a positive way and has communicated early, or whether or not they've held back. And if they have held back, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be someone we're going to work with, but have they learnt from it? Because maybe holding back was the wrong decision. It led to a worse outcome for them in the process. So I think it's all, again, about people. And, I'm a big advocate for deep relationships, honest relationships, being open and transparent. And that goes through every walk of my life. I talk probably too openly sometimes about my personal life with people, but I think it's how you build relationships with people. If you're open and honest, you get open and honest back. If you're guarded and you try and hide things from people, then you're not going to necessarily get a true relationship with someone. And that for me has always been more important. I've always been the person that doesn't have 100 people to a party because I just know 100 people. I'll have 10 people to a party because they're true friendships. And that's kind of how I think and feel about business as well, and employees and anyone really that I have a relationship with.
It's that vulnerability, isn't it? And sort of being open to sharing parts of yourself because you're moving away just from your sort of corporate being to someone who's more broad, and that then bonds you to other people and allows you to actually perform better in the workplace.
And people want to, it also motivates them as well, because
hopefully people want to work with you as a result.
Exactly. They're like, I want to build this, we're going to achieve this together, you're on a journey together.
Yeah. I definitely don't think, I'm not one of those leaders that's sort of creating the cult of Zenzic. I don't think I can stand in a room and suddenly get everyone to sort of follow me because I'm this amazing visionary. I think that, I'd like to think that people want to work for Tom and I because we're genuine people that share how we think and feel at any one time. We're open and honest about our relationship as well in terms of how we work with one another. There are times where we disagree. We don't stand in a room and disagree quietly in the corner. We'll have it out with each other in the workplace.
Come on, everyone, come out.
But that's because we're just human beings,
Yeah.
and we're passionate about what we're
subject.
doing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, you know, I think that then goes back to who works well in a very large corporate and who works well in a more entrepreneurial environment. You know, I wasn't very good at holding back my views and opinions about things when I was a bit younger, and so as a result, in a corporate environment, didn't necessarily always play well, because people don't always, in those environments, don't always want to hear the truth. You know, they like the more political environment, and some people are brilliant at that. They have made fantastic careers. They've made great money if that's what they're motivated to do, or they've had, you know, hugely valuable careers. But for me, working those big corporates, I didn't work well in those environments because I wanted to be able to be myself. And that meant sometimes not being in at 8 o'clock. It meant being in at 8:30 because I'm rubbish in the mornings. You know, I'm not a morning person. I'm a night owl. I work better in the evenings. I needed to be environments where I could really thrive. And that went right through. I remember, you know, being at school and not being the perfect pupil because I couldn't always toe every line that someone set because it just wasn't who I was. And in education environments, a lot of the time they can't work with that because they need everyone to be in a box.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really be in that box, and I needed to be in an environment where I could thrive, and which is why I set up my own business. What I'm trying to do is allow people to be themselves and thrive in my business. So you don't have to fit a box to work well in Zenzic. You can be your natural self.
I want to come back to something you said before, which I loved about being a rule breaker, not a rule maker. Mm-hmm. It'd be amazing to hear from you how you're innovating within the sector, and particularly kind of exploring an alternative strategy or approach.
Sure. I mean, I think the big thing for us at Zenzic was always that what we could see, you know, developing in the market was that the lot of capital chasing a similar type of transaction and similar size of transaction. And there's absolutely many reasons why you would do that. You know, there's maybe a deep marketplace that you can go after, and maybe that's your area of expertise, and so you want to capitalize on where your experience set has been. But a lot of the time what that means is that there's markets being left behind that actually present really great opportunities, both, you know, from an investor perspective and for people that want careers in spaces maybe where others aren't playing. And we talk about this analogy in Zenzic where we like to fish in waters where the fish are fat, but there aren't lots of people fishing. It's about where there are gaps. And that was really, if you think about Zenzic's journey, it was initially, where is there a gap? There was huge amounts of corporate finance experience in private equity, but not so much in private credit, because back when we founded Zenzic, the private credit market was very nascent. It was growing. It was the non-bank lending sector really emerged post GFC in the UK. It had been far further ahead in the States than it was in the UK, remains further ahead in the States than it does in the UK, but, you know, over the last decade has developed in probably a greater way than I envisaged it growing, given, you know, England is not necessarily the place where you see huge leaps and bounds in certain sectors over a period. There's certain markets that we've been brilliant at, and obviously if you go back decades, manufacturing, you know, we were very ahead globally. But, you know, if you look at it now, we innovate in certain pockets and we don't innovate in others. And so in my mind, the private credit market, I wasn't probably expecting it to evolve in quite the way it has in the time frame that it has. And so, you know, which I think is brilliant, you know, and obviously has allowed us to really make a mark in the market. But a lot of people have left behind the lower mid-market, the smaller ticket sizes, the 20 to 50 million bracket is where we like to play across the UK and Europe, but where many don't. And obviously the piece for us now is being able to convince investors that this is actually where, you know, there's merit in putting your capital with a group like ours, where we're accessing, you know, transactions that maybe others aren't expert at accessing, that maybe they haven't spent the last 15 years working in a marketplace that actually, has huge demand, but doesn't necessarily mean you're putting out a lot of capital on day one into a transaction. And that's often what is, important for an investment management firm to be successful. Often it is about, being able to deploy capital and decent swathes of capital in any one given transaction. So you see a lot of people congregating around similar sized transactions. And what we're trying to do is really play in markets where the capital isn't as deep. And as a result, we can really, create a market for our firm. And that really is about not necessarily, you're not creating rules as such in those scenarios, but you're trying to innovate. You're not necessarily fully disrupting, because, you aren't, I always think about disruption in a market being much more aligned to technology and, product design. Here we're talking about areas where there's some great borrowers and there's some great real estate, but they're just underserved by capital. And what they need is people that will work with them in partnership in different areas of their business to help them grow, to help them deliver their vision. And that's really what we're trying to achieve at Zenzic.
Obviously, as a kind of fellow woman in business and in I suppose a sector that isn't very kind of female dominant, especially when I think actually really nice to see more women coming through, but certainly not at senior levels are there many kind of women that we come across.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you how that journey has been in
Sure.
terms of being kind of establishing yourself as a leader, but also how that then informs the way that you kind of nurture and build a team around you as well, kind of future female leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely evolved and improved, I think, as a sector a lot over the last 5 years. Prior to that, I think there were less female network groups. There were less individuals really championing women coming through the real estate investment sector and the real estate sector as a whole. Certainly when it comes to investing, I think, there's always been that natural propensity for maybe the women coming through to take more of a back seat in terms of being at the table and really sharing their views and opinions. It's always difficult. Even now I see huge benefit of female networking groups, despite that evolution. In fact, some of the capital that's within Zenzic now is a direct result of people that I've met at a female networking group. I think you can gain a lot from learning from your peers, and often your peers are people that have had similar experiences to you in life. And so, obviously if you're growing in your career and you want to, as a female in the industry, and you want to take the next step, naturally, I think a lot of the time women will speak with other women who have gone through similar experiences. I do think, by the way, that men have a lot to offer women coming through the sector in terms of their experience of maybe having worked with larger businesses, or they're entrepreneurs and they've had great women in their businesses. So I think that men should never shy away from giving women advice in their career. I think it's always important to get both sides of the story. But I think, as a leader in this space now, I think that I've really evolved my thinking about how I help other women in the sector grow. I think that I was quite under the radar until really probably only 18 months, 2 years ago, I think, is when I really started to see that I could really help other women grow in their careers by being more of a voice. I was someone that was quite happy to participate when asked, but I wasn't necessarily the one driving the story in the market about me, my background, what I've achieved. It's back to my imposter syndrome, I guess, to some extent, and I think a lot of women experience this. I think men do too, by the way. I've met a lot of men that I would naturally think are very comfortable in their own skin and in a boardroom environment, and yet actually when you speak to them you realise that they feel the same way as I do sometimes in a room. But I think that women genuinely can help other women to feel more confident about themselves and their next steps in their career. I've met a lot of women who read a job description, for example, and say to me, well, I really like the look of this role and I think I would definitely be able to do well, but I don't meet everything that's on the job description. And I say, you know, there are a lot of men that would look at that job description and almost say, I actually only tick 2 or 3 things on the job spec and I'm going to go for it because I think I'm great and I'm going to do well in that role. And they're going to sell themselves to that effect. And that's what I want to encourage more women to see, that actually there's far more to life than just a job description when you're going for a role, you know. And that's sometimes hard. I think just natural way a woman thinks about themselves is sometimes that they need to tick all the boxes to even be able to be at the table, and that's not always the case. And so I really try and champion more women to think about taking more senior roles, maybe become founders themselves. And you know, people always ask the question, can women have it all? You know, I've got 2 children and run a business, and I answer that question very honestly, you can't. You know, you can try to deliver every level, but there's always going to be something that you're not doing brilliantly at because you can't possibly do it all at once, and you need a lot of support. But that's not just a woman, that's also a man as well, you know, in their career. But I think the added piece around having children often is what stops women from thinking, right, they can come back to work post children and they can create a business or they can have a senior leadership role, because now they're trying to juggle family life and, you know, business. I think you can do it, but I do think you have to make sacrifices. You know, I have my mother live with me. I have a full-time nanny. I have a husband who is incredibly supportive and, you know, does a lot of the school drop-off, pickups, you know, working with them with their education, all the things that I guess, you know, traditionally a woman may have been more involved with. And I couldn't do what I do without all of that support. But I think if you acknowledge that you need support, you can ask for help, then, you know, I think a female can have a great career in a leadership role. But I think it's acknowledging to some extent that actually some of those balls aren't always going to be up in the air all at the same time. And you can't be dedicated to everything in the same level, you know, all at the same time. And that's, I think, sometimes hard for a woman to accept. And that's what I try and encourage women to realise, that you can have a great career, you can have a family, you know, and sometimes it's not always about women that have had children. Some women just do think that they don't deserve necessarily to be at the same table, and I really try and that's nothing to do with the fact that they've had children. That's just confidence issues. And I think it's really trying to work with women to say, actually, you know, think about all the ways in which you've added value in your role at any one time, and think about how to articulate that. And I think you can get help. I think, you know, men definitely help each other. Women actually sometimes don't help each other enough. And I think what the female networking opportunities do is it puts women in that are like-minded in the same room, who want to help each other, who want to see other women flourish. And I want to encourage that as much as humanly possible.
Reputation is what people say about you when you're not in the room. What do you want people to say about you when you're not in the room?
I want people to say that what you see is what you get, that she's a genuine person, she says things from the heart, she's, you know, well-meaning, but she's driven and she won't hold any prisoners, but at the same time she will allow people to really thrive and she will support whenever people need it. Those are the things that really matter to me, that people think about me. I don't want, I think you can have, the one thing about being a female leader is often, you know, you can create a bit of a male facade, you know, because you've got to be strong, you've got to be seen to be this sort of, I guess, more of a male personality to be able to really survive and thrive in an industry that is obviously quite male dominated. And I want people to be able to say, actually, she's her natural self,
Yeah.
which obviously comes from a feminine background. And sometimes that means that, I'm in a meeting and someone says something and it makes me cry because that's just me, and I want them to see that side of me because that's who I really am. They've said something that's affected me, it's bothered me.
Yeah.
Or it might be because, I, for example, recently was quite emotional about someone wanting to leave Zenzic. I really liked them as a person. I wanted them to stay within the business. And I got really upset in the resignation conversation because I didn't want them to leave, But I knew probably in my heart of hearts it was the right time. It was the right point in their career. But they'd meant a lot to me during the journey of their career within Zenzic. And so, that's... Sometimes people find it hard to be themselves, and I really want people to see, who I really am, and I hope that's what people would say about me in a closed door environment when I'm not in the room.
I think that's actually really powerful that you touched on that point of, like, in order to be a successful female leader, you can be feminine.
Yes.
I think that's in saying that, like, you've come, and it shows that we've come such a long way because, before there was this sense of having to be quite masculine or putting on a front or not being oneself, having to actually perform.
Yes, exactly.
To gain respect, to gain confidence. And isn't it such a beautiful thing that you can lead by just being you and saying that's enough? Like, that's powerful.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think that there's too much often that I see in this industry of those individuals that feel a need to put a facade and a certain way about them to the market because that's, they've got a view on what they think people need to see in order to be successful. I think often people, that I've heard say, when they've talked about me, and they're there and I'm here and I can hear them talking about me, is that, they'll often say that, Nadine is very much open, honest, person who won't put the facade on and speaks very much from the heart. And I want people to see, the journey that we've been on, and that, as I've built Zenzic, that it hasn't always been, plain sailing. There's ups and downs because that's, kind of what happens when you own a business. And I don't think people can learn from you if you're not an open and honest person. So that's really, my hope that people would see that in me.
So we're going to end on this question as we do with all our guests. If you could reinvent one thing about the real estate sector, what would it be?
I think a lot of the real estate sector has been very driven over many, many decades on credentialism. And absolutely it has its place. But I think Zenzic's proof that actually you don't necessarily need to create an investment management firm from having been a spin out of another large investment management firm, that you can be innovative, you can be entrepreneurial in the sector. And I think real estate has lots of entrepreneurs in it, but I think when you think about how they're backed often from a position of maybe they've had very, very long-standing track records in a particular given space, or maybe they've had backing from a very large group, and the way you think is actually, I'm going to lend to that person because they've been previously backed by a major real estate investor, and so they must be the person that we should be backing because someone else has given them capital in the past that maybe is bigger than us, and so must naturally think better than us. I think that ultimately our view is that you can, back to meritocracy, you can be brilliant and young and less experienced, and you may not have had a career in real estate before we've before you've come up with a great idea, and actually we should be the party backing you. And I think the same goes for hiring. You don't necessarily need to have had a 20-year career to be hired by Zenzic, because actually maybe you've come at this industry, from a different walk of life, but you bring something to the table that we can see as value add. So I think it's that movement away, if possible, from, you know, being an industry often led by credentialism that I would want to try and encourage more people to think about when they're thinking about the growth of their firms and or the parties that they're backing.
Brilliant.
Nadine, it has been such a joy talking
We
to
could
you
be here all
today.
night. I want to keep going.
I could sit here listening to you all day. But thank
thank
you
you.
so much for joining us on the podcast. And
Thank you.
we've certainly learned a lot through what you've just said, and I'm sure we'll sort of resonate with it for many weeks and months to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Reinventing Real Estate podcast, brought to you by Harris Associates in partnership with PBSA News.